What's going on, everybody? My name is Curci, and I just played Resident Evil Village, and now I want to talk about it. This is a game that I was very excited for, not only because it's a Resident Evil game, and if you've seen some of the videos I put out in the past, you know that I am a big Resident Evil fan, but building up to this game, I had a lot of expectations. Looking at Resident Evil 2's remake, and looking at Resident Evil 7, I just wanted it to do the survival horror element, which it seemed like it was doing, but I also wanted it to bring in that Mr. X style element, which it seemed also like it was doing in the form of a big, giant, beautiful woman. So I was very excited for this game, and I jumped on it as soon as it released, and now we're going to do the review. The thing with reviewing a Resident Evil game is that you have to run it through the checklist of just being a video game. So does it have a good story? Does it have good gameplay? Stuff like that. You judge it about being a video game because it is at its core a video game. But on the other hand, because it's a Resident Evil game, you also have to run through the checklist of it being a good Resident Evil game. So I think that this video game is a good game. I don't think it's the best Resident Evil game, but we will get into it. And before we get into it, I would like to remind everybody to please give this video a like. It helps out tremendously. Also consider subscribing to the channel. Hit the bell icon so you can be notified of all new video uploads. And with all of that said, let's talk about Resident Evil Village. So Resident Evil Village is the 8th main Resident Evil game. It is Resident Evil 8. It follows up Resident Evil 7. Now, I do want to say, in order for me to set the stage for the story of Resident Evil 8, I need to spoil some elements of Resident Evil 7. So if you have not played Resident Evil 7, would highly recommend that you go ahead and do that. After playing Resident Evil 8, I did go back and replay Resident Evil 7, which I'm doing right now. But just a forewarning, I am going to spoil some of the elements that are in the story of Resident Evil 7. So that's just out there. Just a forewarning, Resident Evil 7 spoilers. So Resident Evil Village picks up 3 years after the events of Resident Evil 7. You have Ethan and his wife Mia are off living in some country, and they have a young baby girl named Rose. And things seem to be going pretty good for themselves. Like they're trying to forget some of the horrible events that have happened to them in Resident Evil 7. That is until Mia gets killed, and all of a sudden here's Chris Redfield, and he's kidnapping Ethan's daughter Rose. So immediately you're like, what the hell is going on? All this stuff is in the trailer for Resident Evil Village, so I don't feel that bad telling you the setup. And it's also right at the beginning of the game. Chris Redfield shows up, he kills Mia, and then kidnaps Rose. It's just what happens. But it also sets the stage for this game because now Ethan needs to go and rescue his daughter. And so he finds himself in this village while he's chasing Chris and getting his daughter back, and there's a castle on a hill, and there are monsters about, and a Resident Evil game takes place. Now, I will say about the story, there are some elements of it that I feel like is just bad writing. I think that overall it's a relatively decent story. I think that it ties into the universe pretty well, but there are certain things that happen in the story that just don't make sense. Some answers make more questions. And I feel like it does the thing where, without getting too detailed, if characters just talk to each other, then certain things don't have to be as complicated as they are. I might, at the end of this video, go into a spoiler talk, but I'm going to save that to the end of this video. I'll just tack it on as like a couple of minutes of me just talking about spoilers. We'll do that at the end. But either way, I think that the story, it was good overall, but I do think that it does just have some bad writing tropes. Now, judging from the title of this game, Resident Evil Village, you knew that the village was going to be an integral part of this game. And looking back on Resident Evil games, you know that there is usually a hub location that you're always coming back to, either to access new areas that will provide more story, or you go off and you do a thing and you acquire an item and now you can access different rooms that you couldn't before. That was the case with Resident Evil 1, with Resident Evil 2, and again with Resident Evil 7. There are other Resident Evil games do that as well, but I'm just talking about of the games that I played, Resident Evil 1, 2, and 7 are the best examples of what a Resident Evil game should be. Keeping in mind I never played 4, although I do intend on playing 4 soon. But either way, you knew that you were always going to be coming back to this village, but looking at the trailers and looking at that castle and knowing that, oh my god, well that's going to be like the mansion. You go to that castle and you're going to be accessing different rooms and labyrinths. There are going to be traps and puzzles for you to unsolve. That is Resident Evil in its truest form. So Resident Evil is all about acquiring items to access different rooms, special keys to access certain doors. I kind of figured that like it was going to equally split the castle and the village, that you were going to be going into the village, you were going to gain things, and then you were going to be able to access certain rooms in the castle. You were going to gain things, go back to the village, do more things, then go back to the castle, do more things. But in reality, the castle isn't that featured, which isn't terrible because the game is called Resident Evil Village. But one of the things I was disappointed about was that when you're in the castle, you are also being pursued by this giant woman, Lady Dimitrescu. Now, I know the internet really loves Lady Dimitrescu, by the way. I'm more of an Ada Wong guy. Now, she was heavily featured in the trailers, and you kind of figured that, like, while she was the villain, there was some other sort of entity above her, and that is the case, but I thought she was going to be more featured than she was. And she does fulfill the role of Mr. X when you're in the castle and you're running around and you have like this stalking enemy that's coming after you. She is that stalking enemy. Not for nothing, but she also has 3 other daughters that you cannot kill all the time. They also fulfill that role. You'll be roaming through the castle and all of a sudden a swarm of bugs will show up and it will form into one of the daughters that will come after you. And your only choice is to run, such as the case with Lady Demetress. But again, even I was disappointed because once you get past the castle area, you don't encounter her ever again. Which means that Mr. X element is no longer there. And that was a little disappointing because one of the more stressing things about being a horror game is having these enemies that you cannot fight against. Outlast did that, Alien Isolation did it, Resident Evil 2 did it. I don't know, I just kind of wanted that game from Resident Evil where there was that tyrant-like enemy that was always coming after you. I thought it was going to be Lady Demetress, turns out it wasn't. Now, as far as being a survival horror game, we'll lean more into the horror elements because for the most part, this game is a horror game. There are a lot of horror themes, particularly one location that I won't get into, but there's one location where it takes all of your weapons away and you're just kind of running around an area. It's almost like an escape room, but it's more of the psychological horror. It's more of what Ethan is seeing in that moment. And there's a thing that Ethan sees that is freaking terrifying. I hated it. But that's the reaction that you want from a horror game. Now, I say that this game was a horror game for the most part, which kind of leans into some of the things that more disappointed me about this game, in that occasionally there were moments where it felt a little bit more actiony than it probably should have. Now, if you're doing a game that is survival horror, you need to acquire a little bit of this balance. While it does have the horror element, also there's the survival element. Resources are so few and far between, ammo is scarce. So when you pull the trigger to take out an enemy and fire your gun, you're making a commitment that if I fire this weapon, I better hit and make the most out of this bullet, because if I miss, that's a wasted bullet. I think games like The Last of Us do that well. I think Resident Evil 2 does that well. I think Resident Evil 7 does that well. And I think that some elements of Resident Evil 8 do that well. But I also think that Resident Evil 8 also does this thing that some horror games do. I think The Evil Within even did this, where it gives you a bunch of ammo, then it gives you a bunch of enemies that you now have to unload that ammo into. Now you have no ammo because you went through all those enemies, but the game made it feel like you had to go through those enemies. I would get it if it were a situation where swarms of enemies were coming after you, but you don't have to fight them. You can run away. That's an option. That leans more into the horror and the survival element of it. But when the game presents sequences where it's like, we're going to send waves after waves of enemies and the game's not going to continue until you take out these waves of enemies, then it leans more into that action. And especially when you consider that these enemies are bullet sponges, which isn't a new thing for Resident Evil games, but it does feel at times that you just have to unload your ammo into these enemies, and it feels like ammo's not scarce, you're just using a lot of it. And so I think that Resident Evil 8 doesn't necessarily acquire that perfect balance that, say, Resident Evil 2 or Resident Evil 7 does. In Resident Evil 7, there were sequences where there were 3 or 4 or 5 enemies, but it was only 3 or 4 or 5, not like 10 or 12 or however many that Resident Evil 8 was throwing at you. It only gave you the amount of ammo that you needed for a situation. If it was coming up to a boss fight, and not for nothing, but boss fights are always going to feel actiony in Resident Evil games, but that's just the nature of the beast. Resident Evil games are always going to have boss fights, and those boss fights are always going to feel very actiony. I'm just a little disappointed that it doesn't hold on to the horror element all the time. Toward the latter part of the game, when the game's wrapping up, it does feel a lot more actiony, where it even one sequence it feels like a first-person shooter. But if you play Resident Evil 7, it maintains that level of horror throughout the entire game, acquires a little bit of a balance between the amount of enemies that you have and the amount of ammo that you need to get through them, but also the amount of ammo that you're acquiring. So it never feels like the game's giving you too much ammo, it's giving you just enough. And maybe that's the case with Resident Evil 8, but if Resident Evil 8 were a little bit more subtle about its action beats, then I would be a little bit more forgiving about the amount of ammo that it was giving you. But it wasn't so subtle, it was straight up just, alright, well now Ethan's just gonna blast his way through the situation. I don't know, it's disappointing. It's not necessarily something that I would want from a Resident Evil game. Now, speaking of other elements that are from Resident Evil, I was a little disappointed at the fact that the backtracking wasn't as Resident Evil as it probably should be. But if you look at Resident Evil 7, the centerpiece of that game is the Baker household, where you are always going back to it, you're acquiring keys to access certain doors, but you are always returning to the Baker household to run around the house and find story elements or pieces that will help you advance further. Same thing with Resident Evil 2. Even though you were going to these off the beaten path areas, you were always coming back to the police station, and you are always navigating a different area of the police station that you couldn't before. And that's kind of what I was hoping that would happen with Resident Evil Evil Village, and it technically does. You go and you access the castle. Okay, I acquired a key. Now I can unlock doors that I know are in the village, but really it doesn't advance the story. It's just extra things you can do. In other words, you don't have to go back to the village. I mean, you do have to go back to the village to access the new areas. I mean, look back on Resident Evil 2, right? So you go through the police station the first time, and then you go into like the basement area or the boiler room. You have your first boss fight, and then when you go through the garage and you make your way back in, you are now being pursued by Mr. X. So the game not only feels different, but you're still in the same areas because there's this enemy that is always stalking you, but now you have the means to access different areas of the police station that you couldn't before, and you need to access those rooms to acquire different items that allow you to progress in the game. Such is the case with Resident Evil 7. In Resident Evil 7, the first time you're in the Baker household, you're dealing with Jack Baker, who's always coming after you, but then after you have like that boss fight in the basement with the chainsaws, you then go off and you fight Marguerite. But then you come back to the house and you are accessing these different rooms that you couldn't before because now you have a new key and you're trying to acquire these key cards that are scattered throughout the house so that you can access the area where you can get to Lucas Baker and again progress the story. And I think that Resident Evil Village doesn't do that specifically. I think that might happen like once. You're in the village at the start of the game, then you go to the castle, you're in the castle for a bit, then you come out of the castle, and then the game tells you that you have to go to a very specific house within the village that you couldn't access before in order to acquire a specific item that allows you to progress in the game. That's good, except that's the only time that the game does that. After that, the game's more like, oh, well, you're gonna acquire all the other bits in the other areas of the game, and you're just kind of passing through the village. So I'm not gonna bash the game too much because it does do it. It's just, I feel like there's a better way of doing it. There are 4 different areas of the game that are not the village, and I feel like every time you return from a different area, that you now have a different item that allows you to access a different part of the village. You spend time in the village, you go to the castle. Then you spend time in the village and you go to the next thing. And then you spend more time in the village and then you go to the next thing. Instead, it felt like you spend time in the village, you go to the castle. You spend time in the village, you go to the next thing. Then you go to the next thing. Then you go to the next thing. In between every next thing should be the village. That's what I'm saying. But if we're talking about items, I feel like one of the key things about Resident Evil is inventory management. It's all about you are acquiring items, but then you have to fit the items in your inventory, and your inventory has very limited space. I mean, in Resident Evil 7, you only have like 8 slots at the start of the game. You can carry very few things, and you can find upgrades throughout the game, and the same thing here. Like, there's a merchant in this game, he's called the Duke, and you can purchase additional inventory space from him, because in this game, it actually has a little bit of a store system, so you can find items that are out in the world that are considered valuables. There might be treasures, you'll find treasure maps, and it'll lead to a chest, and that will have valuables. Some valuables can combine with other valuables to maximize your profits, but you sell it to the Duke will give you money, and then you can use that money to either buy weapons, you can buy ammo, resources, upgrades for your weapons, you can even go out and hunt meat, you can bring the meat back to him, he'll create a dish, and then if you eat the dish, it will give you additional bonuses like an increase in health, or you'll take less damage when you guard. And one of the things that I actually really appreciated was the fact that the Duke didn't give you everything if you had the money, because if I just maxed out all ammo, then it would kind of break the game in terms of its survival element, because you would just go out, collect money, then come back to this guy and cash in all your money, get all of your ammo, and then you have ammo for days. But instead, what the Duke does is that he runs out of stock, and the only way he'll restock is if you go and complete a different area of the game and come back. So I appreciated that element. It also provided a little bit of a safe area. Whenever the Duke was around, I was like, oh, thank God, I'm not being pursued by Lady Dimitrescu anymore. But going back to the inventory management, the game is actually a little bit different in terms of how it manages its inventory. So you have your area where you have limited space to carry your weapons, your ammo, your health items. But the problem is that your key items and crafting items are not included in that inventory. Instead, they're kept in a separate menu. So if you're finding scrap metal or gunpowder or chemicals or herbs, they're kept in a separate menu, and it's different from the menu that has all of your items. And so I think that takes away from the Resident Evil element, because once you do craft a first aid kit or first aid bottle, whatever it is, first aid, it goes into your inventory, but the items that you use to craft them don't. And I think that's part of the element of Resident Evil, because when I was playing Resident Evil 7, I was carrying chemical fluid and I was carrying herbs, but there were times where I just had too much chemical fluid and I was like, crap, I'm gonna have to put some of this stuff in my inventory box because I need to have room for additional ammo or even potential key items that I might find. But also I have to carry a certain amount of key items because you never know when you're gonna need them. If I go to that place, crap, I need this key. Now I have to run all the way back to the safe spot where an item box is, acquire the key, and then come back. Which also this game doesn't have, because the key items are in a different menu. Every key item that you find is always on your person. And I feel like that's just a little lame, because I like this idea of you don't know what you need to carry, and so you're telling yourself, I have to carry this because I don't know if I'm going to need it. But if I carry it, it's going to take away inventory space from something that might actually be valuable, like healing items. So taking those key items and removing them into a different menu, I think takes away from that Resident Evil element, which was disappointing. All in all, I think that this game was a good video game. I just don't think it's the best Resident Evil game. I think that the gameplay is fun. I think it does horror very well. When the horror is good, the horror is freaking good. But also I think that it gets a little bit too actiony in certain locations, and I wish that it had just maintained its horror like Resident Evil 7 did a little bit better. I think that the inventory system and the backtracking with the village could have been a lot better. Also, in terms of its writing, I think overall the story was coherent and has connective tissue with the greater Resident Evil universe, but I also think that it just has some poor writing things that it does. This isn't that much of a spoiler because it's right at the beginning of the game, but Ethan's talking to his wife Mia, and he's like, do you really think we can forget everything that happened at the Baker house? And I'm like, bro, it's 3 years ago. Why all of a sudden are you bringing this up now? If you couldn't get over it 3 years ago, then you're probably not going to get rid of it, so you have the answer to your question. It's not like trying to forget about it's a new thing. And not for nothing, you went through some dude. You're not going to forget about that stuff. The other thing that pisses me off is Mia's actively trying to forget about the events that happened in Resident Evil 7. This traumatic and traumatizing thing that happened to her for 3 years of her life. She's actively trying to move on from it. She's trying to be a good mom. And Ethan's just like, hey, what are you doing? You trying to forget? You think you can forget? Like, shut the up, Ethan. I don't know. It's just weird dialogue. It's not only that. There are moments in the game where the writing doesn't make sense. And I think that all of that prevents it from being a really great Resident Evil game. So with my ranking, where am I going to put this game? I'm going to put it on, it's a good game. But if I were to consider it a good Resident Evil game, I would say it's okay. So as an overall ranking, it's good. As a Resident Evil game, I'm going to put it on, it's okay. So that's what I think about this game overall. Now, I do want to go a little bit more into some spoiler stuff with the story that I do want to bring up, and so I'm going to bring it up. But the majority of my review, the spoiler-free portion, is done. So for those people that are going to be dipping out at this point, thank you guys so much for watching. Please give this video a like. It helps out tremendously. Also consider subscribing to the channel, hit the bell icon so you can be notified of all new video uploads. But now we are going to get into spoilers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a graphic down here at the bottom, and now we're in spoiler territory. So full-on spoilers for Resident Evil Village. So one of the things that annoyed me the most in this game is the fact that Chris Redfield does not tell Ethan what's going on. Immediately he shows up, he kills Ethan's wife, he kidnaps his daughter, and then tells Ethan to stay out of it. It's like, do you really think he'd stay out of it? Do you see what he did in Resident Evil 7? What makes you think he would stay out of it after you murdered his wife and kidnapped his daughter? No, he's going to come after you to save his daughter because he thinks you're a murderer and you have his daughter. But in truth, we find out later that Chris didn't kill Mia. Mia was kidnapped somewhere at some point, but the person who is Mia at the beginning of the game is not actually Mia. It is the villain of the game who is shapeshifted into Mia, Mother Miranda. And what they're going for is Rose. Rose is the target because in Resident Evil 7, you have Evelyn, who was a manufactured, genetically created child that also had control over the mold, and the mold makes a return in this game. But Rose is the perfected version of what Evelyn was supposed to be. We also learn that Ethan has been dead the whole time in this game, and that he's just some sort of mold creature. He's been dead ever since the beginning of Resident Evil 7, actually, when he goes to that like guest house and he finds Mia and he fights Mia, and then Jack Baker first shows up and stomps on his face. He essentially murders Ethan in that moment, and then from there he becomes infected with the mold, and for the rest of Resident Evil 7 and for all of Resident Evil 8, he is just a dead guy, which explains a little bit more why he's able to get his hand chopped off and he's able to just reattach it, or his leg chopped off and just reattached it, which seems like it's a very cartoony thing for Resident Evil games to do. But now it's like, oh, well, he's just not a full person. That's why he's able to do the things he's able to do. But through that, he and Mia got together and they made a baby. So Mia, a normal human person who, by the way, at one point was infected with the mold and then got cured in Resident Evil 7, but now she's presumably just a normal person. But Ethan is sort of like this human molded hybrid, and they were able to make a baby, and the result was this Evelyn-like being. And so that's what Mother Miranda's going after, and she's doing it because she wants to bring back her daughter, because we find out Mother Miranda that through the mold she became an immortal being, and her daughter died of the Spanish flu like centuries ago, and she's ever since been trying to bring it back. And we learn that Mother Miranda actually inspired Oswald E. Spencer to create Umbrella and do all of the things that he's done throughout the entirety of the series. Also, what doesn't make sense is the fact that they decided to split Rose into different pieces and put her in these flasks, it doesn't make any sense. If I'm Mother Miranda and my whole purpose is to find Rose, then she gets Rose, why does she split her up into 4 pieces? Like, what is she ultimately waiting for? Like, once she has Rose, can't she just bring her daughter back?
My power is leaving me.
But why though? It doesn't make any sense. The game doesn't make any sense. The writing doesn't make any frickin' sense. But it just doesn't make sense that Chris wouldn't want to tell Ethan what's going on. It's like, listen, I know it looks like I killed your wife, but that's not actually your wife. I don't know where your wife is. I want to go and try to find her. But right now, Rose is in danger, so we need to protect her. At least Ethan would be more on board with Chris's plan going forward. I don't know if he would necessarily want to be excluded, but you have a better opportunity of convincing him to not be involved if you at least tell him what's going on. But the fact that the game is like, stay out of it, Ethan. You just murdered his wife and kidnapped his kid. Of course he's gonna get involved.
We really should have told Ethan the plan.
There wasn't time. We didn't expect Miranda to act so soon.
Even so, you should have told him.
Yeah.
It also begs the question of, if Chris was actively pursuing Mother Miranda and trying to rescue Rose, where the were you? Okay, you show up occasionally throughout the story, but you're not doing anything. You're just observing, you're assessing, you're doing recon. While Ethan's fighting these 4 lords to face Mother Miranda to save his daughter, and then Chris comes in and is taking all the credit. I feel like this game is no different without Chris. When you look at writing a story, and there are elements of your story where it's like, if we remove this thing, does this ultimately change anything? Or could we put something that makes more sense in that role? I think that Chris took the spot of a character that would have made more sense to the story. We know that at the beginning of the game that Mia and Ethan are actually in the area of the village, that they're close to Mother Miranda. So what if Mother Miranda sent Lycans to just attack Ethan's home, kill Mia, and then they take Rose away, and now Ethan is trying to pursue and go after Rose? It's just bad writing. Also, some of the things that also disappointed me was the fact that Lady Dimitrescu was not in the game as much as she probably should have been. Again, I feel like the game should have equally split the time in the castle and the time in the village. She should have been bouncing back and forth. It's disappointing that the game lost that Mr. X element that Lady Dimitrescu was giving us. I just wish that the castle was featured more. Like, it's a freaking castle. It should be much bigger than the areas I was running around in. And knowing that Lady Dimitrescu and her daughters are always stalking you and you cannot kill them, so your only choice is to run, would have fed into a lot more of that horror element that made Resident Evil 2 so good, that makes games like Alien Isolation good or Outlast good, is that you have these stalking enemies that come after you and your only choice is to run. But like right at the beginning of the game, all of a sudden it's like, nah, nope, done. And then you move on to these other areas. It's just not as good as the game was already. There are 3 other minor villains in this game. First of all, the baby fetus sequence is freaking insane. That's the moment I was talking about earlier in the video. That showed up and I was like, I hate this. Like, the game still has the horror element in it, but once it gets to like the end of the game, the fight with Heisenberg, you basically fight him with a tank. And then after that portion, after you've defeated Heisenberg, you then play as Chris Redfield, where it's full on Resident Evil Call of Duty. Then you play as Ethan again, which leads directly into the fight with Mother Miranda. Action, action, action. That's the end of the game. I mean, the game does have that theme of horror throughout. Like, when you do go to the industrial plant, there are enemies that the first time I saw them, like the drill-handed dudes, I'm running away from this guy. I'm not fighting this guy. But then once you realize, just shoot the glowing thing on his chest, then all of a sudden they became a pushover to me and it lost that horror element. But I will conclude my rant and end this video. So thank you guys so much for watching. And you guys who stuck around for the spoiler section, you most likely played Resident Evil Village. Comment below what you thought of the game. Also, give this video a like if you enjoyed it. That helps out tremendously. Consider subscribing to the channel. Hit the bell icon so you can be notified of all new video uploads. I really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.